Now that we've identified what needs to be done to each of our images, which we looked at in the first movie of this chapter, and now that we have a sense of the tools that we can use, which we just learned in the previous movie, we're now going to go step by step through a basic color correction workflow. This workflow has been broken down into 3 main parts, and you can use this formula whenever you approach basic color correction. And we're going to use this workflow with 3 of the 4 color correction tool sets: the color board, the color wheels, and curves. All right, so I have my 10.8 project loaded, the color correction workflow begin, and you can see that here are our uncorrected images, and I'm going to start by correcting Mike here. All right, so I'm going to open up the inspector, Command 4, and then let's click on our color tab. Again, this is new as of version 10.4. And for our first adjustment here, we'll use the color board. And the first adjustments that we're going to make are exposure adjustments, so make sure that your exposure tab is selected. We've already asked ourselves how we need to change the contrast of this image, and now we just need to do that. But before we make any adjustments, we should open up the appropriate video scope. If you'd like to stay in your default editing workspace, you can just go to View and then Show Video Scopes, or Command 7, and then your video scopes will open. But if you want to give yourself a little bit more room, you can actually change to the Color Correction and Effects workspace. So you can go up to Window, and then Workspaces, and Color and Effects. All right, so it hides my library and my browser, and it gives me my video scopes over here on the left, and then my viewer, and then my inspector, and it also opens up my effects browser, which I can close. All right, and instead of looking at 4 individual video scopes, I want to be able to see this a little bit better. So I'm going to change this from 4 to 1. And the video scope that we want to start out with when we're adjusting exposure is the Luma waveform. So I want to make sure that waveform is chosen and Luma. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how to read this video scope. This is read from left to right, just like the image. And then down here at 0 is video black, and up here at 100 is video white. So if you take a look here, here are the lightest parts of our image, these pillars in the background, all right? And then you have some more pillars over here. And then the darkest parts of our image are right here, which are the chairs in the background. And we also have some dark parts around Mike's face, these shadows. You can see that this trace here is Mike. So as I hover scrub through this, you can see which parts are his torso and his arms. And so what we want to do is align the darkest parts of the image with video black, as long as there is a true black, which there is. And we want to align the lightest parts of the image with video white, okay? So we're going to start by coming over to our exposure controls. Again, just to remind us from the previous movie, this is our master control, so it affects things uniformly across all Luma ranges. Not what we want here. I'll undo that. And then we have our shadows, our midtones, and our highlights. So I'm going to grab my shadows control and then drag down, and I'm going to bring the darkest parts of my image to rest right around 0. And I can go a little bit below if I want to introduce more contrast. At the end of this workflow, I'll show you how you can bring that back within limits. All right, and then I'm going to bring my highlights up just a bit. You can see that the brightest parts of the pillars are already resting right around 100. So again, I can bring that up just a little bit above 100. And again, we can clip that at the end of the process if we want. All right, so here is the before and after just on adjusting my shadows and highlights. So a big difference so far. And then your midtones are often a judgment call. You can make them brighter or darker as you see fit. But one thing to keep in mind is that you want the flesh tones to be around 70–75%, which you can see that they are. So as I just make this subjective decision, I think I'm just going to lower my midtones just slightly. And in general, I'm happy with this exposure adjustment. If we look down here, you can see all of the amounts that we adjusted our exposure by. All right, so that was step 1. Step 2 is where we correct color balance problems. I'm going to move from my exposure controls to the color controls, and I'm going to switch from the Luma waveform to the RGB parade. So I'm going to go to RGB parade, and the RGB parade breaks out the signal into the red, green, and blue color channels. So usually our aim here is to balance the image across the 3 color channels, specifically in the areas that should be color neutral, which are the black and the white parts of our image. So take a look here. Right here are the chairs in the background registered in the red, green, and blue color channel. So things are pretty balanced. We really don't have an obvious color cast in our shadows. In our highlights, so the columns in the background, let's take a look at where we're at in the red, green, and blue color channels. And again, things are pretty even. I would say that the only thing that I might correct would be the red shadows just a little bit. You can see that the blue and the green kind of come down and the red are a little bit higher. So I can take my shadow control and come over to the reds and bring that down just a little bit. All right, so I'm happy with my color balance. Not really too much of an issue with this image. Now I'm going to change my video scopes again, and we're going to move to the vector scope. All right, so the first 2 video scopes that we looked at largely measured luma values. This doesn't look at luma at all. It just looks at the color of the image. And you read this like a color wheel. We have red, magenta, blue, cyan, green, and yellow. So we have most of our values hanging out right in this yellow and red zone with this sharp protrusion out into the blue and cyans, which are our tables. But otherwise, we have things basically where they need to be. But I want to point out this line here, and this is the flesh tone line, okay? So right in between yellow and red, you have the flesh tone line, and you generally want to make sure that your flesh tones reside along this regardless of the race of person. So I'm going to just warm things up a tiny bit, and my flesh tones are controlled by my midtone control. So I'm going to take my midtone control and bring it over to my oranges and yellows and bring that up just a little bit. And you can see that my trace is creeping up along the flesh tone line just a little bit. Now I'm going to move over to my saturation controls. And if I look at my vector scope, the values towards the very center of the scope are the most desaturated. So if I brought my master saturation all the way down, you can see that there are no values within the vector scope. If I bring my saturation values all the way up, you can see that the image is very saturated, but also everything is creeping out towards the edges. Now, when you are color correcting a person like this, you usually want the saturation to be about a quarter of the way out from the center. So I think we could up our saturation just a little bit. I'm going to bring up my master saturation and my midtone saturation. Okay, so you can see that trace grow within the vector scope along the flesh tone line, and I'm pretty happy with that. Here is the before and after, and that's definitely a dramatic difference. Now let me go back to the Luma waveform, so waveform and Luma. And I had mentioned that there were a few values below 0 and above 100 that we would fix later. Now, if we were just putting this out on the web, we wouldn't have to fix it. But technically, if we are sending it to television, we do want to make sure that everything is within legal values. So there's an effect for that. I'm just going to come over to my effect browser, and I'm going to type in broadcast. And there it is, broadcast safe. And take a look at the values that are hanging out here below 0 and above 100 when I apply this. Okay, so everything was clipped, and it's really not anything you can really see unless you're paying super close attention to the lightest and the darkest parts of the image, but that little of an adjustment you really won't be able to detect. Okay, so now let's move to Casey, and I'm going to go through the entire workflow again, but more quickly, and I'm going to switch to another tool set so we can get used to correcting within multiple tool sets. So let's apply the color wheels, okay, and I'll give myself a little more room here. All right, so I want to make sure to bring my shadows down to 0 and my highlights up to 100. So I'm going to come to my exposure on my shadows and bring that down a little bit. And then I'll come to my highlights and bring that up. And I'm going to let that soar above 100 because I have this light shining in the background. And we'll go ahead and clip those values at the end. But we want to make sure to bring everything up nice and bright because it was so dark. And I think I also want to raise my midtones as well. And you want to make sure that the flesh tones are around 70, 75, which we are. However, look what happened here. When I was making all of the adjustments on my highlights and midtones, my shadows crept up. So this can be a little bit of a dance. I just need to bring that back down. So I'll come back down to my shadows, and bring that back down. You can see the contrast come back into the image. And I'm just going to bring my midtones up a little bit. All right. So we've corrected the exposure. Here is the before and after on that. Now let's move to color balance. And this definitely has a color balance problem. So we'll go to RGB Parade. And so we want to look in our shadows and make sure that they're neutral. And you can see that the blues are too high. And we want to look in the highlights and make sure that they're neutral. And you can, again, see that the blues are too high. So that makes sense because this image is too blue. So I'm going to take my shadows, and my blues are over here, so I want to drag away from that. So I'm going to warm up my shadows, and I'm looking at the RGB Parade, and I want those to even out. All right, and let's do the same thing in our highlights. Warm those up, and midtones as well. And I need to go back and fix my shadows. Again, just a little bit of a dance as we make these adjustments. All right, now let's move to our vector scope. And I'm going to warm up the flesh tones just a little bit. They already are on the flesh tone line, but let's bring those up just a tiny bit and have those grow along the flesh tone line. And I'll bump up my saturation just a bit as well. And let's apply broadcast safe. Okay. And here is the before and after on this adjustment using the color wheels. All right. And now just very quickly, I'm going to do this last image using curves. So let's switch over to Luma waveform. And we'll add our color curves. And I'm going to adjust my shadows by dragging the shadow control point to the right. And I'll adjust my highlights by dragging the highlight control point over to the left. And I'll bump up my upper midtones just a little bit. And now I'm going to go over to the RGB Parade. We need to fix this color cast, so we need to raise the blues in the highlights. So I'm going to come over to my blue curve and bring this over, and I'm watching the RGB Parade until that evens out. And now I'll come down to the shadows on the blues, and we also need to raise those. So I'm going to raise the blues and the shadows, like so. And I'm going to come to my red curve and lower the reds and the shadows just a little bit so that everything is aligned. All right, so here is the before and after on that. Definitely a big improvement. If I go to my vector scope, you can see that I probably am going to need to adjust the saturation just a bit. As we know from the previous movie, there is no saturation control on curves. So I would just add either a color board or color wheels. I'll add a color board, make sure that saturation is selected, and we'll just bump that up just a bit. And we don't need to add broadcast safe to this because we are within our legal levels. All right, so as you can see, there is a certain workflow you should take in correcting your images. But as you do this again and again, you'll get faster and more efficient, and it will become second nature.